Good day, my fellow Americans and good people of the world. Today I'd like to address you in brief in regards to the release of the video from the apparent police cam, body cam on the ICE agent who shot and killed Renee Good in Minnesota. I understand that the administration themselves have shared this content, and they're trying to disperse it widely throughout social media in an apparent attempt to give the perspective and supporting of the narrative that they've already distinguished and determined before this video even became, knowledge probably even to them, but also to the general public. And that preliminary narrative tried to suggest that this ICE agent acted in what was suggested as a self-defense measure in order to keep people, himself included, safe from a perceived threat. And I've now watched the video multiple times, and I just wanted to add my interpretation of my perception, my perspective, and my proposition being, nothing but an outside observer with a conscious awareness that regardless of the why, the end result remains the same, that an American citizen has been shot dead by a government agent. In my interpretation of it, it appears that there were two factors, potentially three factors actually, that were made apparent by the actions of that agent. The first one being intimidation and the need to show force to reinforce that intimidation in an act to respond to the agitation of bystanders that were putting pressure on this ICE agent in the circumstances, in contrast to them performing their duties, and the community members that were present were making comments that were reinforcing the ideals that the community did not want ICE there, and that they believed that ICE did not belong there. The agent then appears to be in concert with other ICE agents, attempting to surround the vehicle in which Renee Good was in, with the intent to, again, obviously show force in intimidation. And it is apparent in the video, you can hear from this angle the other ICE officer approaching the vehicle and making an attempt to enter the vehicle, again, without warrant, without justification, and without the, legitimate authority to even make an arrest, because no obvious and apparent, prevention of their work was obvious, seen as the vehicle that the ICE agent, whose perspective we're seeing through this film, was able to drive past without, being blocked by this vehicle, drove right past this vehicle, came about the other side, was able to exit the vehicle and approach the vehicle, again, with nothing more than bystanders filming what was happening in order to make an accurate account, because we know that we can't trust the, other side to even provide this evidence of, evidentiary proof of videos from their body cams. And then in the actions of this woman, clearly making multiple points in her turn, would, in the obvious attempt to avoid being encircled and enclosed by these ICE agents who were closing in on her, and fearing, obviously, as expressed in the tone and the voice of her expressions towards the ICE agents who were enclosing in on her, and the, obvious threat that posed to her safety and her well-being, knowing that these are armed agents, and she's an unarmed person. The natural response for her to try to exit the situation and get away from, being cornered in, and then God only knows what would have happened to her, had they broke into her door. In an obvious attempt to flee the scene in a way that would not result in her harm, with no clear indication whatsoever her intent to harm anyone else, as she was making a multiple point turn to get out of the triangulation that these ICE officers put her in. The other two apparent things in the video that were made clear, that it was an obvious, determined intent of this ICE officer to continue to film what was happening. Seen as, again, taking back, this wasn't a body cam. This was apparently from his cell phone, the film from his cell phone. So his intent was to make sure that he had this video recorded evidence of what was happening, as the other people were video recording with evidence what was happening from their perspectives. And, that just goes to show, we don't really have much trust in our society or our systems or what is happening right now on our streets involving communities and ICE, to the point where we all have to be on the ready with video cameras to be able to, prove and protect ourselves against lies and distortions coming up. To the point where it is apparent in the way that the video was angled, and how it proceeded, that it was obvious in the officer's mind that holding on to that video evidence was important. And so in his response, which was quick and reactive, was to concern himself with making sure he held onto his phone to continue to film what was happening. And so with his mind distracted by the necessity of holding on to that video evidence, and then the obvious explicitives from him, voicing, frustration, and then him trying to, vocally control the situation through more vocal intimidation of the lady, that his mind is, again, distracted by needing to continuously reinforce intimidation and to continuously hold up the recording of the events, while having a weapon in his hand, accessible to use that force. And in his apparent angle for whatever he was being distracted by, having to hold his phone and having to continuously yell to intimidate, and then, keeping an observant eye on the other person that was trying to get into the vehicle on the other side. There were many different variables that were distracting this person, to the point where he may not have been, consciously aware that this lady was, backing up multiple points and reversing and turning. And from what is apparent in the video, it seems that, he wasn't hit by the vehicle, but he was responding as if he was concerned that the vehicle may hit him. And in the multi-action response of him jumping out of the way of the vehicle, yelling in frustration immediately at the same time while holding onto his phone, yelling explicitives, jumping out of the, way of this obviously turning vehicle that he wasn't in direct line of contact with, but, encroaching in on, and was preventing her from making a safe, escape route, cornering her in, creating a situation of desperation along with his other ICE agents. That his response was immediate to fire upon this woman multiple times, even as, with the hesitation of the first shot, the next two shots had a pause in between them as to where he chose to go beyond even an initial measure of reactive response, given the variables in the situation, as to where he may have felt at one point in time justified to shoot, but to complete with three more, and then complete his action with an explicitive, calling this woman a excuse the language, bitch, and then proceeds to calmly walk towards her vehicle, knowing that he had taken out his target and there was no threat because he took out any chance of there being a threat. Now, from that perspective, I'm not giving justification for what he did, and I am not giving, a pass for what happened, and I am not saying that this exonerates him in any way, but I am saying there's an obvious situation in here in which the jurisprudence of this individual, their proposition, their considerations, their sensibilities, their feelings, their reactions, response, and now knowing a little bit more about the individual, his past experiences in regards to his, enforcement activity and, as it relates to a vehicle, that his response seems to have been excessive beyond what was reasonable, given somebody who was in the right state of mind to be able to perform duties of law enforcement and keeping the peace. And it seems that, the ICE agents themselves created the situational context in which the situation was blown out of proportion and made into something more than it was, and led to cascading effects that led to a woman being deceased. There is no getting around the situation that this man shot and killed a woman at a very close proximity distance. It is clear that this woman had her hands on the steering wheel of her car in the performance of a very quick multi-point turn with a sharp turn of her steering wheel to evade the ICE agents that were closing in on her and trying to prevent her from escaping safely. And it ended up being that this officer, overwhelmed by that situation, clearly not able to make a clear and conscious decision that would not lead to unnecessary use of force, used it against this woman. And then the videos that I've seen of him walking away from that situation and other versions of the videos, you can tell he was hyped up on adrenaline, and I'm sure there were many things going through his mind. And I can't imagine, what sort of troubling situation he's going to be in the rest of his life to have to reconcile this with his sensibilities of right and wrong and his sensibilities of making a mistake and, how do you make amends for that? And, I pray for, this being his you know, day of personal revelation, that he will be able to find a way to be able to forgive himself and forgive others, and be able to, you know, reconcile and restore integrities and do the right thing to, you know, help himself and others grieve, and to be able to begin the healing process, because that really ultimately, guys, that's the right thing to do no matter what. You know, this isn't an argument of, you know, if somebody did something wrong and it can somehow be justified by, you know, some interpretation of the circumstances. It ultimately comes down to, this man took the life from a woman. And how can he possibly be made whole ever again after that? Especially if we're trying to villainize him and demonize him. You know, instead of just pointing to the fact, like, dude, you made a mistake. We really just want you to accept responsibility and take full ownership of this, so that we can all move forward in the right way to make sure that we establish justice here. Because that's the right thing to do, right? That's what law enforcement is about, making sure we're establishing justice. And, you know, and then the other side of it, like, you know, this woman lost her life, you know, in an act of caring and compassion for her community and her sense of, you know, what's right, and doing what she felt was the right thing to do at the right time, in the right way, for the right reasons, with obviously no ill intentions to harm anybody, but rather to prevent harm from befalling her fellow community members, and to stand up against this crazy, violent use of force and show of force by the administration that is fear-mongering and intimidating and flooding our cities with people who are creating a situation, an atmosphere of fear and intimidation, and a sense that, you know, nobody is safe, because that's all that they're doing, you know. And this woman did the right thing. Renee Good did the right thing. And unfortunately, bad things happen to good people who stand up against injustice. Because when we look at the bigger, broader picture of it, there's injustice happening in America with these ICE raids. They're not right. It's not just, it's not fair, it's not reasonable, not necessary. There are better ways to do this. I mean, I myself have found policy initiatives in which we could have, instead of spending all this money to kick people out and, you know, wreak havoc and cause harm and provoke violence and instill a state of fear into people, we could have created a situation in which a full integration of immigration into our society, in which, you know, people are welcomed in with a golden door of opportunity to belong, to be integrated, you know, become one with us, so we don't have to worry about who's here, because we know the people who are here are our neighbors. They're our friends, you know. They're here because they want, you know, to live the good life and to live in a peaceful society just as much as the rest of us. You know, Renee Good was doing a better job of keeping the peace that day than was the ICE officers whose sworn duty was to, you know, protect and serve. And it is apparent that in this incident, that there are going to be a lot of, you know, strong opinions and emotions that are going to be riled up. But I just want to, you know, echo the strong determinations of the leadership in Minnesota that says, you know, ICE, we don't need you here. We don't want you here. You know, please don't make a bad situation worse. You know, let us do what we do best, is take care of each other here in our community, you know. And if you really feel that it's important for you to follow this, you know, order to come in and take people out, whatever, do it at a different time when, you know, emotions are not flared and, you know, obviously, you know, everybody is now forced into a state of mourning when that very morning, that day, you know, life was going on as usual, as normal, until I showed up and instigated this traumatization and inflicted harm upon the American people. The wise thing to do, the compassionate thing to do, the intelligent thing to do as a leader, POTUS and Vance, really should be saying, stand down, guys. We're going to let the situation just kind of calm down. We're going to respect and honor the loss of life, and we are going to, open ourselves up to investigations so we can really get to the bottom of what happened. Instead of playing this, social media, sharing the video, cherry-picked content information so that we can, force the narrative in our direction so we can justify ourselves and cover our own asses, which is exactly what, Vance is doing, exactly what Trump is doing, and exactly what, Trump's media moguls are doing on their social media platforms. They're projecting this sense that there was justification to this instead of doing the right thing, which says that, never should we ever try to justify the loss of life for anybody. We should mourn it and grieve it and find a way to heal from it, and then to use this as, the learning opportunity to establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility and provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty, and they're not doing any of those things. They're creating a context in which society has to pit one side against the other. Do you believe our narrative or their narrative? The wild, radical leftists, indoctrinating people to think and do certain things, and man, they bring this upon themselves. What? Why would Vance ever say that? How about, dear God, an American citizen died on the streets? Maybe we need to rethink our policy and our approach to this, because, this is starting to get dangerous for our own people. And I thought we were all doing this because we're supposed to be protecting the people, And then POTUS not even knowing what happened. It kind of seems like he was misconstruing information that he got regards to this officer having, priorly experienced an injury through, an enforcement operation, where he was dragged by a vehicle. And obviously, I'm pretty sure, given my experience, being a caregiver of people with PTSD, he probably got PTSD from that experience. And so, he's naturally, as Vance even said, it's, he responded in association to that, lived experience that he had that conditioned his mental state in that moment, and altered his perception and informed his bias, so that his decision making was based off of a past and prior decision making that made him feel justified in using force before, diffusing the situation. And so Trump gets this information of what happened before, and then tried to say this man was ran over and he's lucky to be alive. Like, obviously he was misconstruing, information from a prior experience and confusing the information and trying to say that's what happened this time, when clearly there's evidence that never happened. The man never went to the hospital, the ICE agent never went to the hospital. So, this misinformation that's going there, and then not even giving time for investigation to happen, and then preventing local officials to be involved in the investigation so we make sure there's transparency and accountability. Like, all these things is just a cover up. And so what the, Trump-Vance, regime and their MAGA cohort is doing is saying that, people who go on the streets under the guise of immigration enforcement, if they kill an American citizen, they have absolute immunity from ever being held accountable for it. And it's justified because, radical leftists are bringing this upon themselves. And, our ICE agents are being traumatized in the work that they do because, the nature of how they do the work, makes it so that they're exposed to these types of experiences that may be traumatic for them. And then that informs how they're going to continue to proceed with their enforcement. So what they're suggesting is that things are only going to get worse from here. As more and more ICE activities happen, more and more are we going to experience this, contentious, situation where ICE is going to use more and more hostile force. And they are already setting the groundwork, as the administration in the federal level, to normalize the killing of American citizens who stand in the way of ICE enforcement, which is all about, under their terms and conditions, immigration enforcement to keep American streets safe. Which I don't agree with, but my interpretation of the situation is that there was no imminent threat to that ICE officer. He was burdened by many different variables that were beyond his own self-control to prevent him from shooting first, asking questions later. And this lady died because this man shot her, and there's no getting around that. There's no, painting this into a justification of any kind. That's the ultimate truth of things. And the reality is this person should not be, an ICE agent anymore. He should be pulled from duty, and he should have to undergo, counseling, and, and he should be, completely cooperative with a full investigation at the federal and local level to make sure that, everybody understands the situation as it unfolded, and to do his part to make sure that this doesn't turn him into, some bad guy, that is now the face of, the MAGA movement. He's the bad guy. See what bad guys do? Like, I don't want him to have to be in that position either, but I certainly don't want him to be on the streets where, he's now enabled and ennobled and encouraged by the administration to, oh, you did the right thing. Don't worry about it, man. Get out there and do your thing and show some more force for us, because we already told you, use whatever means that's necessary. And you deemed that was necessary. We're perfectly fine with that. Because you know what? We got a little video here that says that, you took the actions that you thought were appropriate in that moment, despite the fact that the situation from an unbiased perspective would say that probably wasn't the right choice, But we're, the administration, we're going to stand by you. Absolute immunity, that's now empowering all the other ICE agents to say, well, fuck it, man, we can do whatever you want. And then just hours after that happened, just a few blocks away from where that happened, ICE agents infiltrated a high school and started, attacking students and teachers and intimidating people and getting mad at them because, how dare you follow us and video record us? You're not allowed to do that. It's like some more evidence proving the aggressiveness, the intimidation, the anger, the threatening that's happening on behalf of ICE agents towards American citizens. Is in itself, they're creating the contentious situation that in their minds, they're justifying, I gotta use extreme force against these people, man, because they're getting in the way of us doing what we should be able to do. We should just be able to walk in and kidnap people off the streets with masks and nobody should say anything about it. It's like, in America, we don't think that's right. Well, we didn't give authorization for the government to do this. This is not governing on our behalf and our best interest. And there are better ways to do this, and we would rather us seek the peaceful route than for you guys to use this violence and terrorization and fear-mongering and, cruelty and insensitivity and inhumanity against us. Like, can't you find a better way? Because there is always a better way, man. And we're willing to work with you to make that happen. But, man, we're going to stand up for what we think is right, and we don't think it's right that you come here and do violence against us. So they're creating the contention themselves. It's like they're fomenting, violence so that they can get other people, to stir it up, because Trump would love it if he could declare, a state of national emergency and we're going to be on lockdown and, guess what? We can't have elections, especially coming up with the midterms. He doesn't want elections to happen. He's running terrified that people are going to impeach him because he knows he's doing the wrong thing. And if put in a position where people will be able to have the power to hold him accountable, he knows he's in big trouble. And so they're going to increase the pressure and they're going to increase the circumstances where bad things happen so they can get to the point where something breaks and then they take it over in a totalitarian form, And this is just the beginning of them trying to do that. So don't let them win. Listen to, the great leaders in Minneapolis and the great leaders in Portland, because we just had another, immigration enforcement agent shooting 2 people in the city of Portland, Oregon, just yesterday, within 24 hours of this happening in Minnesota, we have more violence by immigration enforcement on, people in America, on American streets, gun violence. And so, we need to bring down the temperature. We need to not allow them to villainize nor martyr. We need to use this as, a very tragic and unfortunate but necessary learning opportunity for us to do what we're meant to do as a nation. We have to establish justice, guys. And justice doesn't look like American citizens being shot in the face by masked federal agents. What you see in that video, that's not what justice looks like. That looks like, guys creating a situation of desperation and intimidation to the point where, it led them to think that they were justified in shooting somebody when no apparent and obvious, threat of harm was upon anybody except for that woman, who you can hear before the video. She's like, "It's okay, guy. We're just here videotaping you to make sure we have an account of what you're trying to do here, because you know what's wrong, and we're going to stand our ground to say this is wrong." And the woman was telling them, go by. That very car that agent was in got to drive by her. So it's not like she was, stopping them from making moves, And there really was no justification as to why they would even approach her vehicle, try to take her out of her vehicle, and close in on her vehicle. I mean, there's no justification for that. And it seems to me, right, especially with what I've been listening from the leadership in Minnesota, that, their officers and their, community members and their council members and their neighbors, they're all very well versed in understanding how to look out for each other and how to diffuse situations, and that, they're peace and loving people, and that they can be reasoned with, But when you have already created nationally this intimidation factor that ICE can't be trusted, and, they have this, immunity, and they've been told to use maximum force by the president himself, you're creating the conditions in which these people are scared, and they're acting in response to that fear, very much likened to the acting in response to fear that ICE agent had, obviously, because he, sounds like he has the, mental state of somebody with PTSD. And he was operating off of that place of vulnerability and misinterpretation, and, now that entire community has been traumatized. They all have PTSD now. And instead of the president and the vice president stepping up and saying, this is a moment for healing, and we're going to restore peace and tranquility, we're not going to make matters worse. They immediately went to work to use this as a propaganda tool to force their narrative that they need to do more violence. See, the political left, man, they're mindless radicals. It's like the only mindless radicals in the, seats of president and vice president and their administration. Because they're not taking the mindful, tactful, conscious, considerate, assessment of the situation. They're going immediately on the defense, and then using this to spin to, pit Americans against one another. I am extremely disappointed, and I feel so much pity and disappointment for this ICE agent. But I want him to be made whole too. Because I don't want him or any of his fellow ICE agents to think that they're put in an even more desperate situation where then they would, calculate in their, discernment calculus in a moment, and left to their own devices, that what they would do is to use excessive force. I want them to diffuse situations, and I want them to find a way to do immigration enforcement peacefully, and in such a way that's working with the community, in such a way where we do, weed out the unlikelies of those who are not here, to integrate and live in peace in society. Those who are here to cause harm, yeah, we want them out. Let's work together to weed out those unlikelies and make America a safer place, not turn into this massive show of force on the streets of America that leads to, people getting shot regularly and consistently by these enforcement agents that have been ennobled and empowered by a president that wants to see the chaos and the mayhem because he has no plan of how to administer. He knows how to turn over the world, man, because he can do it with a single finger, but he has no idea how to restore integrities, to instill a sense of peace, and to, cultivate a narrative of unity and acceptance and tolerance. Help us to move through the grieving process together step by step, and to lead forward with healing and a sense of love for our nation so much that we don't want to cultivate a paradigm in which this is a normal thing. He doesn't know how to do any of those sorts of things. It's very much a smash and grab and destroy and burn it all to the ground. Because it's much easier to burn a place down to the ground that has been gentrified, right? And then he can build up his luxury hotels all with his Trump branding across the nation, and say, this is great. Isn't it, guys? So great. There's nothing great about an America that before Trump became president and before Vance became his, minion vice president, we didn't have American government killing American citizens on the street and shooting people on the street. American agents shooting people on the street. We didn't have that before. We'll never be able to go back. We can't fix the shattered and broken pieces. We'll never be able to, make this, be as it was before the bad things happened. But what we can do, and what I hope we do, and what I encourage us all to do, is to take the broken pieces and get a little bit of mortar and fuse it together into a mosaic that shows, we're not perfect. We've never been perfect. But the whole point is to form a more perfect union. And we can do that by, this mortar of sense of unity. What binds us? What's going to bring us together? What's going to be able to mend those broken pieces into a sensibility of, we will always be, just short of perfection. But man, in the imperfections, there's beauty. And there's opportunity in the obstacles. We are challenged to rise to the occasion, to show what America really stands for, what we're going to be about, what we're going to focus on, what we're going to be determined to do. And we gotta find a way to find the tie that binds, build up back better, with the mortar that brings our broken pieces together into this beautiful mosaic of no matter what it takes, we're going to keep us together. We're going to keep America strong. We're going to use every dark moment as an opportunity to shine our light, shine our brightest. Let the broken pieces shine. Let love and, patience and determination be the thing that guides us. With that, I just want to conclude. What I saw in that video was, just more evidence of a series of unfortunate events that ultimately led to the death of a U.S. citizen at the hands of a federal agent. And that until we do the good and necessary work to speak the truth about what happened and really understand what happened, instead of, presuming and making assumptions, until we start seeking the truth and being determined to find it and to establish a base reality in which we can share that in that truth, and we can intentionally work together through the grieving process and externalize that and work together to deeply internalize that and move forward in healing and love, we're going to continue to be on the continuum and spectacle of negative outcome consequences that is the MAGA movement and the POTUS 47 Trump-Vance regime, you know? They're not trying to lead us forward in love and peace and unity, you know? They're trying to cover up mistakes and justify violence. And I'm not okay with that outcome. So with that, thank you for your valuable time, attention, and consideration. May peace be with us all. I love you. Be well.